they came for me at dawn. No alarms, no thunder of guns, just the sound of chanting beyond the door, and the slow rhythm of boots that matched the beat of my heart. I had dreamed of them for years, the black armored silhouettes that haunted every sanctioned psyker's childhood warnings. Stay hidden, the whispers said. Stay quiet, or the black ships will find you. But no one hides forever. In the Imperium, the inquisitorial seal burned through my door as if the metal were wax. I remember the smell of ozone and sanctified oil, the taste of fear, thick as incense. They didn't speak as they entered, not to me, not to each other. Behind their masks, their eyes glowed faintly in the lumen glare, as if the Emperor himself watched through them. They found the mark on my hand, the one I'd wrapped in cloth for years. They didn't need words. One gesture, and I was on my knees. One chain, and my life ended, though my heart kept beating. When the black ships arrive, they don't come to kill you. They come to take what's left. If you hear the hum of the black ships in the distance, if you've ever wondered what becomes of those they take, then keep watching. Share this story so that others might know what waits behind the silent holes drifting across the void. Subscribe to the Whispers of Truth, and when the Emperor calls, may you have the strength to answer without screaming. They always said the Emperor protects, but I learned that protection has many faces, and not all of them were mercy. The morning they came for me, the sun hadn't yet climbed over the Hablock Towers. The world was still the color of iron. I remember the hiss of incense leaking through the air vents before I ever heard the boots. The priests of the administratum always burned incense when something sacred or something unclean was about to happen. I didn't know which one I was. My mother had died whispering that I was touched, not blessed, not cursed, just touched. For years I'd hidden the sparks that danced at my fingertips, the way lamps flickered when I dreamt. But the dreams had grown stronger. I'd started hearing things through walls, voices reciting prayers in languages I'd never learned, hymns that bent the air. And 2 nights ago, when I touched the shrine candle, it burned blue and didn't go out. That was enough. Someone saw. Someone reported it. In the Imperium, someone always reports it. I thought I'd run. I thought the tunnels beneath the manufactorum were wide enough, the slums thick enough, that I could vanish like smoke. But faith finds you, duty finds you, and the black ships always find you. When they came, there was no shouting, just the knock 3 times, slow and patient. The metal door hissed open, and the light flooded in, too white to be natural. They filled the doorway, 5 figures in armor blacker than vacuum, trimmed in gold sigils that shimmered like oil on water. Inquisitorial acolytes, witch hunters. Behind them came the robed Psychona adepts, their eyes bandaged, their lips sewn with threads of silver. By decree of the High Lords of Terra, one said through his vox grill, "You are taken into imperial custody. Kneel." My legs folded without permission. My hands shook as they bound them with runed manacles. The air smelled of sanctified oils and fear, my fear, heavy and sour. The chains pulsed with low light, cold as the void. And for a moment I thought I could hear something whispering from inside the metal itself. They didn't speak again. They didn't have to. I was a psyker now, not a person, not a citizen, not even a name. I was a risk to be transported, a fuel source for the throne. Another voice waiting to be extinguished in the Astronomican's endless hymn. The journey to the spaceport was quiet. The streets had been cleared hours earlier. The citizens knew better than to look at a witch being taken. I caught sight of them through the viewport of the transport silhouettes pressed into the shadows, heads bowed, muttering prayers, not for me, for themselves. To witness a psyker was to tempt fate. The shuttle rose through the clouds, and for a heartbeat I saw the city, endless spires, smoke-stained cathedrals. The slow glow of promethium fires shrank beneath me until it was nothing. Then the stars filled the sky, sharp and cold. Somewhere above them, they said, the Emperor's light burned eternally. The inquisitorial frigate awaited us. The moment I saw it, I understood why they called them black ships. It wasn't color, it was absence. It didn't reflect light, it devoured it. A cathedral of steel and silence, adrift between worlds. No markings, no name. Even the void around it seemed quieter, as though the ship consumed not only sound, but thought itself. The docking clamps locked. The airlock opened. The chant began. By the Emperor's mercy, we purged the soul. By the Emperor's light, we cleanse the unclean. By his will, all serve. Every word was carved into me. They took us. There were dozens of us, dragged from cells, cages, and sanctuaries. Some screamed, some prayed, some stared blankly ahead. The adepts guided us through a narrow corridor lined with iron grills. The light here was red, eternal twilight. I remember seeing the stains on the floor, dark, circular, like something had burned through from the inside. At the end of the hall was a door shaped like a cathedral arch. A single aquila was carved above it, wings spread, one half gilded, one half scorched black. Beyond that door was the heart of the ship, the place they called the Crucible. It was no throne room, no chapel. It was a processing hall. Rows upon rows of psychers, kneeling, each with a servoskull hovering above, its red eye flaring as it measured them. Those deemed too unstable were dragged away through the side gates, their screams swallowed by the hymn echoing from the vox emitters. I kept my head down. I tried to breathe evenly. Each inhale tasted like burnt copper. One of the acolytes stopped beside me. His mask was shaped like a skull, the lenses of his eyes glowing faintly blue. He touched a data slate, checking my identification. Unregistered. Detected level beta psychic potential. Probable survival rating, 14%. 14. I didn't know whether to laugh or vomit to destination. Another voice asked. Terra, the acolyte said. For the throne. The words were cold. Ritual. Final dot. The crowd of psychers was marched forward toward the loading bay, a yawning hangar where gravity itself felt thin, like a wound in the world. The sight beyond the containment field stole my breath. The stars were wrong here. They didn't shimmer, they bent. The void around the ship seemed to ripple like black water, and I knew, even before they said it, that we were on the edge of real space. The Imperium awaited us. A servitor pressed a brand against my neck. The hiss of heated metal seared through the air. The smell of burned flesh followed. I didn't scream, not because I was brave, but because I was too empty. I was no longer me. I was cargo, as the gates sealed and the engines thrummed to life. I looked through the viewport one last time. The planet below was shrinking, fading into a sphere of ash and cloud. Somewhere down there, 1,000 voices whispered the same prayer, that the Emperor would forgive the unclean and shield the faithful. I wondered if he could tell the difference any more. Then the stars broke apart. The light stretched thin, and the black ship slipped into the warp. The screaming began before the first day was over. They called it translation, but it felt like drowning without water. Gravity slid sideways in my bones, and every thought had an echo, as if my skull were a cathedral and something vast paced the aisles. The hymn on the vox never stopped. It threaded the hours together into a single, suffocating rope that we clung to because there was nothing else between us and the dark. They herded us into the lower pens after the crucible weighed, measured, branded, and logged us. The pens were stacked like hive cells, each a rectangle of plasteel with a floor drain and a wall shrine carved in low relief so even the condemned could face an Aquila. The first thing I tasted was old iron. The second was fear. By the third hour, the fear tasted like me. There were perhaps 50 in our block, shackled along a central chain. Across from me sat a woman with eyes milk-white and unblinking. She rocked and whispered nursery songs from some agri-moon I would never see. Next to her, a man in ragged pilgrim robes muttered catechisms and bled from his nose every time the ship turned. A boy no older than 12 curled around his own knees and watched the floor as though it might speak back if he stared hard enough. No one gave their names. Names were dangerous. If you said them wrong in this place, other things might answer. The first time the silent sisters passed, the air went sour. They came without sound, a blade of bodies cutting the corridor. Gold filigree on blackened plate, heads bare and shaven, their faces calm as statues. Their presence hurt, not like a blow, like absence too wide to look at directly. My thoughts staggered. The small, involuntary sparks that had danced in my fingertips for years gottered and died, leaving a hollowness that made me want to retch. The Psychana adepts called them blanks. The sisters called themselves simply vigil. We called them what our tongues could manage: the quiet, the anathema, salvation with a knife in it. One stopped outside our pen and looked in at us the way a surgeon might study a lesion. She wore a torque inscribed with sigils and a mask at her belt, a death mask in hammered gold. No breath fogged from her mouth in the cold. She raised 2 fingers. The adepts behind her unlocked our gate, and 3 of us were taken: the boy, the pilgrim, and an old man who hadn't spoken once since we were loaded. None of them fought. The boy looked back only once. His eyes were not angry. They were not begging. They were empty, and that was worse. What happens to them? Someone whispered after the gate slammed. It was the first voice in ours that wasn't the hymn. Screening, said a woman farther down, rasping. Some for Terra, some for the choirs, some for the dust choirs. I asked before I could stop myself. The Astronomican, she said. The beacon they say the master of mankind sustains. 1,000,000 souls singing so ships like this don't go blind and dead. They burn clean and bright, and then they're gone. She laughed, a sound as brittle as the frost that formed around the vents. Merciful, isn't it? Quick. I tried to imagine 1,000,000 voices folded into one note, a single star pinned over the cradle of mankind. I tried to imagine being a spark in that fire. 14%, the acolyte had said. Probable survival. The number meant nothing here. Numbers were a promise made by people who would never pay it. The ship shuddered. Somewhere deep in the keel, a machine the size of a cathedral changed its mind. The Geller field thrummed sweeps through my marrow, a pressure like a held breath. I felt it falter for the space of a heartbeat. In that heartbeat, the whisper found me. It was not words. It was the shape of words, the suggestion of 1,000 mouths behind the wall. Cold flooded my palms, up my wrists. The Aquila on the wall seemed to bend, its twin heads turning toward each other, beaks touching as if conferring. Then the hymn surged, and the field's pressure returned, and the knot voice slid away like something denied at the threshold. A man laughed to cells over. Did you feel it? Did you see it? He had the wild eyes of those who had looked too long into bad light. He was there. He spoke to me. Who? Someone spat. The golden one, the man breathed. He said my pain was counted, he said. His words eroded. He began to cry and did not stop for a long time. Perhaps he had heard something. Perhaps it was only the brain trying to make poetry out of knives. We measured time by feedings and checks, by the cadence of the hymn, switching from litanies to lamentations to invocations. Once, alarms flared amber, and we heard boots pounding above us like rain. A squad of naval armsmen thundered past, visors down. One made the sign of the Aquila without slowing, as if to daub warding over us with his eyes. When the alarms died, the air smelled faintly of ozone and cooked meat. They didn't tell us which hold had failed. The ship did not drift, so we were meant to be grateful. On the fourth watch, the sisters returned. With them came a figure, hooded and masked, a Psychona preceptor carrying a Crozius-like staff that hummed with captive wards. He did not look at us as people. He looked at us as a tally, assessment, he said. His voice had the tired patience of someone who had watched a river carve a canyon and learned nothing new from it, one at a time. They took me to a chamber that had once been a chapel. The stained glass had been replaced by adamant shutters. A single lumen hung from a chain, swaying so that my shadow rocked across the walls like a hanged thing. The preceptor stood with a date. The sister stood behind me, closer than breath, and my gift shrank to a pin. I could feel the edges of her nullfield, pricking my skin like sleet designation. The preceptor said, "Unregistered," I answered. "From Habla Colton, no oath band." He didn't nod. "Hold out your hands." I did. He pressed his palm to my branded neck, and the runes in the manacles woke cold enough to burn. He began to chant, a low susurrus in high Gothic, a request and a warning braided into one. The lumen steadied. The air thickened. The world cinched tight as a tourniquet. "Think of nothing," he said. "If you cannot think of nothing, think of the Emperor." I tried. The Emperor was an image on 1,000 shrines, a skull crowned in laurels, a figure of gold on a throne of wires. The more I tried to fix him, the more he slipped away, replaced by the memory of my mother's breath failing under my hand and the blue flame of the candle that would not die enough. The preceptor said softly. He took his hand away. I realized my teeth hurt from clenching them. The sister had not moved. Her calm frightened me more than the preceptor's power. "Batalival," he murmured, checking a column on the slate. "Instability within tolerances, under null pressure, useful." He paused, and for the first time looked up as if I were not a tally but a shape. "Do you know where you are going?" "Terra," I said. The word was larger than my mouth. "For the throne." He inclined his head. "If you survive evaluation, you will be given to the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. The Emperor's work consumes the willing and the unwilling alike." He tapped the slate with his stylus, its click like a nail in wood. "Remember your prayer, not for deliverance, for purpose." The sister touched my shoulder, 2 fingers, light as snowfall. In that touch was the annihilation of everything that made me dangerous. In that touch was also the first kindness I had felt since the door in my hab slid open. It was terrible, and it was gentle, and if it had asked me to walk into fire, I think I would have. They put me back in my cell. The man who had laughed at visions was gone. The woman with milk-white eyes had stopped rocking. She sat very still with her hands folded and her lips moving in a prayer too soft to hear. Somewhere above us, something scraped the hull. It could have been debris. It could have been a thought with teeth. The hymn rose. The scraping ceased. On the 7th watch, a new smell entered the air. Not incense, not oil. Freshness, a current of air that had not yet learned our fear. The voxim dimmed until we could hear our own hearts and the distant labor of engines turning on axes larger than cities. A bell tolled, deep and slow, once, twice, thrice. Making for anchor, someone breathed. No one spoke the word, but it was there like a sunrise behind a locked door. Terra. I did not know if that meant salvation or ending. Perhaps both. Perhaps that was what salvation had always meant in our age. We waited while the bells counted, while the sisterhood walked past and the adepts checked seals and the armsmen polished the same piece of metal they had polished 1,000 times. The chain linking us to one another felt heavier than it had that morning, or my shoulders had learned the weight of it. At last the gate opened again, and the same acolyte with skull-lenses stood there with his slate and his impassive voice. "Processing," he said. They unlocked the chain. The first 5 were led away, the second 5 after them. I counted the paces to the door. I counted the paces from the door to the corridor. I counted the breaths it took for the hymn to swell again until it crested over us and broke, carrying us forward like driftwood. When my turn came, the sister fell in behind me, and for a moment my gift flickered like a candle trying to find itself in wind. I thought of the preceptor's measured voice. I thought of the boy's empty eyes. I thought of the Aquila, of twin heads that could not agree on whether to watch the past or the future. I stepped into the corridor. The lights here were brighter. The air was colder, and somewhere ahead, beyond doors thick enough to stop a god, lay the face of a world I had prayed to all my life. The light on the corridor walls no longer stayed still. It ran like oil over metal, thick and sluggish, as though the ship itself were sweating the warp. We had been in translation too long. I could feel time thinning, days unspooling into one another, like blood through water. Sleep came in snatches. When it did, it was never empty. I dreamed of eyes behind my eyelids, vast, lidless, watching through the weave of space. Sometimes they were human, sometimes they were not. When I woke, the same hymn still throbbed through the vox, slower now, a heartbeat dragged through static. Some of us had begun to hum with it, not from devotion, but because silence had become unbearable. The holds had changed. The air was colder, damper, thick with the breath of thousands. Frost clung to the bars. We had learned to read the ship's moods by sound. The low tremor of the plasma drives meant calm. The shriek of overstressed plating meant the Geller field was under strain. When the field weakened, thoughts that were not ours crept through. Some came as whispers. Others came as feelings, vast and slow, brushing the edges of the mind like a giant hand feeling along a cage. The first to break was the pilgrim woman. She began reciting scripture backward, word by word, voice steady as liturgy. Then she smiled, and kept smiling, even after the quiet took her away. They left a smear of ash where she had knelt, shaped like a wing. We stopped speaking after that. The hymn was safer. It gave the voices no room to answer. Still, they found me. It began as a pressure at the back of my skull, like a memory too large to hold. When I closed my eyes, I saw light not the flicker of lamps or the flares of the warp, but something deeper, structured, infinite. It pulsed in time with my pulse. It called. The others felt it too. One by one, they began to stare upward, mouths open as if tasting air that wasn't there. The old woman whispered, "He's coming." But she said it the way one might speak of a storm, not a savior. On the sixth cycle, the warding lamps along the corridor burned gold. The adepts came, faces hidden behind brass respirators. Choir selection, one intoned. The chain unhooked from the wall. My legs trembled. When the gate opened, the pressure in my skull surged, a tide of heat and static. I stepped forward without meaning to. They led us upward. The air changed as we climbed. The smell of oil gave way to incense, then to ozone. The decks above were cleaner, the walls lined with scripture in fine calligraphy. Servitors drifted along the ceilings like insects, their mouths chanting fragments of the Emperor's name. The chamber they brought us to was immense, a hollow heart running the width of the ship. At its center hung a sphere of crystal the size of a gunship, alive with crawling fire. Around it stood hundreds of psychers in iron collars, their eyes glazed with radiance. Cables sprouted from their skulls, disappearing into the sphere. The air shimmered with their collective breath, the faintest hum of endless prayer. The choir whispered an adept. "They sing the ship through the warp." He said it with reverence, but there was pity in his eyes. None of the singers moved except to breathe. Some had no tongues. Some had no eyes. Yet from them came the low thrumming that steadied the ship's bones. They tested us there, one by one, touching the crystal with rods of silver. When the metal neared my skin, the voices inside the light roared. I heard words that were not wordstones, that folded meaning into pain. I saw, for a breath, the curve of Terra's orbit, the halo of ships forever circling, feeding the throne. I felt the hunger of that beacon, patient and holy. I screamed, I think. The adepts recorded something on their slates. "Marked," one said. "Reserve for transmission duty." Back in the holds, the others kept their distance from me. They said my eyes glowed when I slept. I didn't argue. The light still burned behind my eyelids, bright and cold. It whispered that we were chosen, that our pain meant purpose. that every scream was another candle for the Emperor's gaze to follow through the dark. I wanted to believe it. Belief was armor. Without it, you went mad, and madness here was not private. It leaked, the days or hours blurred. More taken, fewer returned. The hymn grew louder, less human, as though the ship itself was beginning to sing once. When the Geller field faltered again, I felt the choir's voices rise all at once. A single desperate note that pressed my face into the deck. The void beyond screamed back, and the hull flared with runes of light before falling silent. Afterward, the adepts walked the corridors, sprinkling blessed salt and the ashes of burnt saints. One stopped at my cell. His respirator hissed as he studied me. "You heard it, didn't you?" I nodded. The gesture cost everything I had. He leaned closer. "Then pray it never learns your name." That night, if it was night, the light returned in my dreams. But this time it wasn't distant. It was a face made of suns, serene and pitiless. It did not speak, yet I understood. We were all pieces of him, drifting toward the center to be remade. The thought filled me with joy and horror in equal measure. When I awoke, the chains were gone. The doors of the pen were open. Beyond them, adepts waited in silence, holding censers that bled golden smoke. "Ascension deck," one said. "Chosen souls, forward." I stepped out, the mark on my neck pulsing in rhythm with the ship's hymn. The others followed, eyes glazed with the same fevered light. Somewhere deep in the hull, the choir began a new verse, slower, heavier, like the drawing of breath before revelation, and I understood that the next song would be ours. They told us the Ascension deck was the holiest place aboard the black ship, a sanctum where the faithful were transformed into instruments of the Emperor's will. But when the doors opened, what I saw felt less like ascension and more like surrender. The chamber was vast, built around a cathedral spire that pierced the ship's upper decks like a blade through flesh. The walls were lined with containment pylons, each humming with runic wards that flickered in and out of sight, barely restraining the psychic pressure that swelled and ebbed like a tide. Incense hung heavy, but it couldn't hide the metallic temps of blood, oil, and ozone. The air shimmered with power. I could taste it, feel it, crawling beneath my skin. We were led in rows, shackled at the wrists and neck. The adepts walked among us, murmuring liturgies while servo-skulls floated overhead, recording our every breath. I counted hundreds, maybe thousands, of sight. Some knelt in prayer, their eyes hollow but serene. Others twitched and mumbled to unseen things, drool pooling at their knees. At the center of the chamber stood a raised dais, surrounded by a halo of lumens shaped like the Emperor's sigil. Upon it, a figure waited tall, draped in crimson and black, his armor etched with scripture that seemed to writhe as the light touched it. His face was a death mask of beaten gold, expressionless, divine, and merciless. Around him stood 6 silent sisters, each with their swords drawn, their presence turning the air brittle and thin. When he spoke, his voice was not amplified, yet it filled the entire hall, resonating in bone rather than air. "Children of the throne," he said, "you have been gathered here not for punishment, but for purpose. Each of you has been touched by powers beyond mortal comprehension, powers that corrupt the weak but empower the faithful. And through your sacrifice, Humanity endures. A murmur rippled through the rows, half prayer, half fear. I bowed my head, though I couldn't tell if it was reverence or instinct. You will serve, he continued, as conduits for the Astronomican, the light that guides all mankind through the Imperium. Through your pain, his will is manifest. Through your death, his fire burns brighter. He lifted one hand, and the adepts began moving again. Lines of psychers were unshackled and guided toward the dais. The first to go were serene, smiling, some even singing. The rest of us watched as they were fitted with iron collars, cables threading from their spines into the machinery above. The hum deepened. The pylons began to pulse. The runes flared gold, then white. I felt it before I understood it, a pressure in the chest, a tearing at the edge of thought. The first group began to convulse, their mouths open in silent hymns. Their eyes burned like coals. And then, as one, they stiffened, and a beam of pure light shot upward into the spire, cutting through the deck above. The glow was magnificent, terrible, infinite. The chanting adepts fell to their knees. Ascension complete, one whispered, but they weren't ascending. They were gone. The smell of ozone was now joined by something sweet, like burnt sugar, or flesh rendered into perfume. The air shimmered with ghostlight, the psychic residue of hundreds of extinguished minds. I could hear them, faintly, their screams and songs braided into one endless note of devotion. Another group was led forward. This time, some resisted. One man broke free, shouting that the Emperor had forsaken them. He ran toward the exit before a sister's blade found him, swift and soundless. His head rolled once, twice, then came to rest at the base of the Aquila carved into the floor. No one else tried to run. When my turn came, I felt nothing. Not fear, not courage, only exhaustion, the hollow ache of inevitability. The adepts fastened the collar around my neck. Cold metal, sacred oil, the scent of incense thick enough to drown in. The priest, the golden-faced figure, approached. His eyes were hidden behind the mask, but I could feel them on me, measuring, weighing. You burn brightly, he said softly. Perhaps bright enough to glimpse him before you fade. I wanted to answer, to ask what happens to those who do not fade, but the words died in my throat. The collar locked with a click. A needle slid into the base of my skull. Fire spread through my veins. My heartbeat slowed, then steadied with the rhythm of the ship itself. Around me, the machinery stirred, cables tightening, pylons flaring. The hymn rose again, louder now, as if the entire ship were singing. And then the pain came. It wasn't pain like flesh knows. It was the pain of the soul being unfolded, spread too thin. Every memory I had, every thought, every moment of joy or grief was pulled apart, stretched into light. I felt myself expanding, rising beyond the boundaries of my body. For a heartbeat, I saw everything. The warp stretched before me, a storm of souls, fire and madness. I saw the black ship like a black tear floating in a sea of screaming color. I saw faces forming and unforming in the currents, demons, angels, ghosts of all the things humanity had forgotten to fear, and above it all, a light, not the Emperor's light, but something behind it. You are not consumed. You are transformed. I tried to hold on to the words, but they dissolved as quickly as they came. The hymn reached its crescendo. The The power surged through the conduits, through me, through every living mind in that chamber. The world fractured into white. When it faded, I was still standing. The others beside me were not. They had burned away entirely, their ashes forming perfect halos on the floor. The priest looked at me with something almost human in his voice. Survivor. The sisters turned their gaze toward me. I felt their null fields pressing down like cold stone. My body trembled, but I did not fall. Take him to containment, the priest ordered. The Emperor has use for this one. The adepts obeyed. They removed the collar, though its heat had already branded my skin. My mind buzzed with static. Not quite silence, not quite noise. And beneath it, faint but clear, a whisper still lingered, not consumed. As they led me from the chamber, I glanced back one last time. The dais was already being prepared for the next group. The machinery hummed, ready to devour another 100 souls in the Emperor's name. And above it all, the golden mask turned toward the spire's light, as if he too heard the whisper behind the hymn. I wondered, then, if any of them truly knew what it was they served. Containment meant a coffin the size of a man, and a viewport the size of a coin. They kept me there for days that slid into one another without edges, watched by blank-faced adepts and the occasional passing shadow of a silent sister. I slept when the ship slept, and woke when its machine prayers stirred. Ate when a tray arrived, prayed when the hum of the wards rose high enough to set my teeth on edge. I learned the rhythm of the black ship, the way a man learns the rhythm of a storm, by counting the seconds between flashes, by knowing when to hold your breath and when to let it go. Sometimes, if I pressed my ear to the cold of the wall, I could hear the hymn of the ascension deck leaking through the hull like heat. Sometimes I thought I could hear a second voice under it, steady as a heartbeat and immeasurably far away. We translated without fanfare, the ship clenching around itself and then relaxing into real space like a fist. The change came first as taste, copper, and dust, the temps of charged air. Then as a pressure in the skull that eased, leaving a silence so profound I mistook it for deafness. A chime sounded, locks turned, the viewport's shield irised open, and for the first time since they chained me at the levee square, I saw a sky. It was not my world's sky. It was a plane of black limpidity, cut with the cool knives of distant suns. And off, our prow swarm of lights, like a vast shoal of living silver ships. Thousands of them. Hulks, barges, pilgrim arcs with stained glass prows. Spear-nosed cruisers with gun decks like teeth. Adepta craft incised with scripture. Statues sailing on engines that burned blue. In their midst, like bones strung with fire, hung the rings of Saturn, thronged with dockyards and latticework cathedrals. And beyond all that, a brightness that was not any one thing, but the sum of all things. The Astronomican, invisible to the eye, and yet felt in the marrow like a hymn one has known since birth. I could not see Terra, but I felt its pull. The way a sleeper feels the pull of morning. They moved me with others survivors. The word had a new weight, now through corridors, scrubbed to clean to have a history. We were vermin in a sanctum, but useful vermin, and the guards kept their weapons angled down. Ahead, great blast doors parted, and the ship's throat opened to the void, a docking cathedral, ribbed with stained steel, incense streaming in banners from We crossed the bridge into a waiting transport whose hull was painted the deep blue of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. The pilot did not speak. The sisters did not blink. The priest with the golden mask boarded last and took a place by the forward bulkhead where I could not quite see him. The hatch sealed, thrusters whispered. We left the black ship behind like the casting off of a skin. The approach to Terra is a pilgrimage, even when you are a prisoner. Our craft threaded traffic like a needle drawn through crowded cloth, passing escort boats whose flanks glittered with prayer plaques, skiff swarms carrying tithe grain and tithe blood, pilgrim tenders that stank of spice and sweat, and the stubborn joy of those who believed they might glimpse the palace and be absolved by proximity alone. For a heartbeat a gift, or a mistake thaw, transport's external feeds flickered across our cabin screen. The planet filled the frame, not blue, not green, but a burnished metal world, wrapped in orbital scars and armatures, a diadem of stations and gun platforms and shield lattice. In the Terminator's pale light, the Himalasia glittered like the teeth of a crown, and above them there stood no other word will do the idea of a palace. I did not see walls. I saw an outline scored into the idea of the sky. I didn't know my jaw had gone slack until a sister glanced my way, and the shame of being witnessed drew it shut again. They took us not to that impossible silhouette, but to a lesser sanctum by any measure except a mortal's, the towers of the Scholastia Zicana, where the Astra Telepathica weighs and measures, breaks and binds. There the air smelled of parchment and oil, and bodies kept too long in close quarters, of old incense baked into stone. There the floors were worn concave by centuries of feet. There the adepts spoke in undertone, and the walls had ears, literal ones, carved and gilded, watching as we were catalogued bone measurements taken, soul patterns pricked and tasted, names erased and replaced with numbers that fit better in ledgers. Some were led away and did not return. Some came back smiling, to calm, and flinched at the voice of a fly. A boy no older than 12 was marked for the choirs, his eyes already clouded by the first brush of the right. I envied him his youth for a heartbeat, and then hated myself for the envy. We made a strange fellowship, we who had not burned, a sister from a mining moon, whose hands trembled only when they were at rest. A tall man with the livid scar of a collar seared into his throat. Me, with the priest's words, survivor, dragging behind like a chain I had chosen. When they came for me, there was no speech of mercy and no promise of pain. The adept simply lifted his data slate, confirmed my sigil, and inclined his head. The sisters flanked me, the null of them pressing like winter air. We climbed. Each landing carried a hololithic depiction of a different saint, of the mind saint Basileus, unblinded, Saint Luthien with her fingers in a demon's mouth, Saint Telemenes standing on the throat of his own shadow. The higher we went, the thinner the air of other people's thoughts became, until only my own breath kept me company. At the last door stood a single, motionless figure in oromite, not a statue, a custodian guard, still as a drawn blade. He did not look at me. He did not need to. A heartbeat later, the door sighed aside, and I was inside. The chamber was almost bare. A dais, a chair more like an altar. Cables and conduits coiled overhead like sleeping serpents. The walls were dusted with ash where other candles had burned down to nothing and been replaced. The golden-masked priest waited by the chair. He looked smaller here, or perhaps simply human in a room that refused grandeur. I hated him for an instant, which felt healthy, then watched the feeling drain away like spilled water into ancient stone. "You understand," he said. And because he did not inflect it as a question, I did not answer as if it were one. He gestured, and I sat, and the leather was colder than anything has a right to be. The bindings closed, gentle as a mother's hand, and held just as firmly. Somewhere in the walls, engines woke warmth blooming to life, light dimming fractionally as power bled into some circuit that had not carried it in hours or years. "The right is not a promise," he said softly, so only I could hear it. "It is an offering. You offer what you are. He offers what remains." I wanted to ask who he was in this room, the emperor, as we had been taught, enthroned and eternal. The idea of mankind's will brought to a point, the light that had not been the light on the ascension deck, the echo I heard under the hymn. But his tone made questions small and foolish. A sister stepped forward and anointed my eyelids with oil that smelled of myrrh and hot metal. The mask lifted a fraction. Lips moved behind it. The words were old enough to hurt. Then the world came apart, like a rope pulled too hard. The soul binding, if that is what it was, does not translate to speech. The mind makes metaphors the way a drowning man makes bubbles. I fell without falling toward a brightness that had no center, and every center a wind that was also a choir. A line of gold drawn through endless night, and the night pressing close as if to kiss or kill. Memories blew out of me like ash my mother's hands. The levee square, the taste of orchard dust at harvest stand were replaced by something colder and infinitely larger. For a sliver of a sliver, there was something like a face in the brightness. Not a face, an attention, and it noticed me the way a sun notices a mote dancing in its fire. If there were words, they were not meant for a throat. If there was mercy, it was the mercy of a fire that burns clean. When I came back, the candles were blue ghosts, and the oil on my lids had dried to a thin, fragrant crust. I could not see. Whether the blindness was ritual or ruin, I couldn't tell. Sight had been replaced by, not sound exactly, presence. The room was a pressure map in my head. The white cold absence where a sister stood, the warm knit gravity of the priest, the iron certainty of the custodian behind the door, like a mountain that had taught itself patience. Beyond them, further than walls, a music the size of a galaxy, singing in one unwavering note, name. The priest said. I opened my mouth, and the label they had given me at intake rose to my tongue like bile. I swallowed it. I was called Marius, I said, and the simplicity of the past tense steadied me. You are sanctioned, Marius. He did not congratulate. He did not console, he pronounced. You will serve as an astropath of the choirs. Your sight is given to the throne. Your voice is given to man. Your life is not your own. He lifted something and laid it across my palms. It was small and warm from his hand, and the smell of it cut through oil and incense with the clarity of memory. Wax and dry fibers and a hint of orchard dust, after all. A folded parchment. A slate stylus. There is ink, he said dryly, and for the first time in too long, I nearly laughed. Write a first sending, if you wish. Few remember what they choose to say. Fewer regret it. They led me to a place where the choirs hummed in their sleep and left me with a screen of quiet around my thoughts. The parchment was blank against my fingers, and my new world was soundless except for the far thunder of the Astronomican and the whisper I had carried out of the ascension deck like contraband hope. I drew the stylus down and felt the grain accept it. If the message ever reached the orchard valley on my world, it will have been delivered by a brittle-voiced adept who mispronounced my name and looked past my father's shoulder to the next door. It might have said only that I served, that I lived, that our levies were not wasted. It might have said nothing at all and only carried the weight of a seal. And that seal might, for a season, have been enough to keep a roof mended and a field tithed and a family's face straight when the tallymen came after the sending. The choirmaster took my arm. The sisters were gone. The priest's step sounded like a man's step, not a right's, somewhere very far away and very near. A black ship slid out of Saturn's shadow and pointed its knife nose at a distant, nameless world where a levee square waited to be chalked. I felt it the way a healed bone feels the weather. You asked what happens when the black ships arrive. This is the last answer I have, somewhere under a sky not yours and not mine. A bell is ringing, and a child is looking up, and a mother is binding a ribbon around her wrist to remember the warmth of a hand she will not hold again. Somewhere, a priest is dusting a lectern and practicing a speech about duty. Somewhere, a row of shackles is being cleaned with oil that smells like incense and thyme. And somewhere here, now I stand in a chamber without windows and hear the song that holds the paths open through the dark. And I lend what is left of myself to the note. It is not mercy. It is not cruelty. It is the price the species pays to still have mornings. I serve, and the light goes on, and the black ships keep their appointments with the night.